They have what you call the magical money machine, where you put in a blank piece of paper and crank out a $100 bill. And of course, con artists used to sell machines like that at county fairs to the suckers. So now, these bankers got together and sold that machine to the people of the United States.
And we're all the suckers for it, I guess. Huh?
Well, they put in the blank piece of paper, they hand out $100. They don't give you the $100. You have to give them $100 worth of labor or real estate for it. In other words, nothing is free. In order to perpetuate their ownership of the magical money machine, the Federal Reserve System, they entered into the bill in 1913 when it went through Congress that you and I could never buy a share of stock in the magical money machine. In other words, the people who bought the original stock in 1914, they own it all today. It cannot be bought or sold on any stock exchange, because if you own a magical money machine, why would you let the suckers buy it from you? You sell them the paper, you don't sell them the machine itself.
Well, how did they purchase this magical money machine? I mean, did they pay somebody off, or was it, I mean, you mentioned before Jekyll Island, and I heard that there was a no-name club at Jekyll Island. Would you tell us a little bit about that, Mr. Small?
Well, these are very important bankers who met there secretly in November 1910. They left Hoboken on a sealed train, and the reporters were there, because these were very important people, and the reporters said, "Where are you going?" And they were all shouting and trying to get into the train to ask some questions. The train pulled out. They wouldn't say where they were going. They went to Brunswick, Georgia, which was the stopping place for Jekyll Island, which is just across the inlet there. And they went over to their private club, and they wrote the act in secrecy, and they stipulated it would be called a Federal Reserve System to delude the public. They stipulated that they would own the stock forever. You and I would never be allowed access to this stock. And they set up a money monopoly in violation of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which provided, the Founding Fathers made sure to guarantee the people of the United States they would have their own money. Congress would have control over the money. So then, after they wrote this secret plan, they had to take it before Congress and persuade Congress to turn over this money power to the private bankers. They did it through bribery, through intimidation, and they got it through just before, they actually put it through after the Christmas vacation started, when some of the opponents left. Congressman Charles Augustus Lindbergh, the father of the aviator, had fought this bill through Congress. He said it establishes a perpetual money trust, and our children will be enslaved by this money trust. He said it all in 1913, and it all has come true. So they got the bill through on December the 23rd, 1913, after the opponents had left, and they immediately rushed it through. No other bill has ever been passed by Congress under the strange circumstances that the Federal Reserve Act was passed. And even the New York Times pointed out, they said, never has legislation of such major importance been passed in such circumstances.
What about the IRS? Did that come in near that same time?
Same year, 1913. The Income Tax Amendment was passed in 1913. The Rockefeller Foundation was chartered in 1913. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913 so that we could have a world war a few months later in 1914. All of this, you see, 1913 is a symbolic year because we're dealing with people who have a deep root in the occult and in satanic work. So for them, 1913 was the year that they wanted to foist everything over on the American people, and they did.
Now, the IRS, if you have the Internal Revenue Service, which is a collection agency for the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve, because those are 2 points, those are 2 of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. Would you say that as of 1913, from a legal standpoint for this country, that we were 20% communist at that time?
Oh, very much so. This is a communist system. In fact, the Federal Reserve bankers originated communism. That's not generally known. But, and you had the spectacle after the Bolshevik Revolution was perpetrated on the Russian people, and they murdered the Tsar and his family. They murdered the Tsar out of hatred, greed, and envy, which is the basis of all communism, hatred, greed, and envy. This hatred, greed, and envy is the basis of every government act passed by Congress in the United States because they hate the middle class. Their greed makes them want to seize the assets of the middle class, and they have such envy that they cannot stand for anyone else to be well-dressed, well-educated, or have a nice home. They want to reduce us all to the status of Chinese coolies or serfs in old Russia.
What do we do? I mean, there must have been some people at that particular time that saw through this con game. What happened to them? People like, say, Bronson La Follette from Wisconsin and Charles Lindbergh that you mentioned. What happened to those people? Because they did stand up, some of them, didn't they, Eustace?
They did, and after Lindbergh opposed them, they financed mobs to chase him through the streets of Minnesota towns where he was a congressman and to threaten to tar and feather him. He was lucky to escape with his life. They took his books and threw them out in the piles of the street and burned them. He wrote books exposing the situation. You can hardly find those books today. They were burned.
Now, you mean to tell me that also, would they, is that how they've been doing it? They've been buying people off ever since 1913 to keep their game. And I know in the government today there's a request by many congressmen to have an audit of the Federal Reserve. Could that do any harm?
Actually, an audit of the Federal Reserve would simply substantiate their legitimacy. I mean, you don't want to audit the mafia. Why would you audit the Federal Reserve? It's an illegal organization to start with. You don't audit a criminal syndicate. You put it out of business, and you lock up the people who perpetrated this on the American people.
Let's go back to Andrew Jackson, because Andrew Jackson threw the bankers out one time, didn't he?
He did indeed.
And the country prospered.
Oh, tremendous prosperity. Andrew Jackson, as President of the United States, said to the bankers, "Ye are a nest of vipers, and by God, I will root you out." And so he immediately took all government funds out of the second bank of the United States, which was a central bank. And of course, they went bankrupt because they needed that money for their operating capital. And in fact, today, every bank and every business in the United States is operating on the Social Security taxes that they collect from their workers by extortion, because without that capital, they couldn't exist.
Now, what about the Rockefellers and the Kuhn-Loebs and some of the Lazarus brothers? Who actually owns the stock? What are some of the names of the people that own the stock in this Federal Reserve system?
Well, you know, I was the first person to ever publish those names. In fact, Congressman Wright Patman, who was chairman of the Banking Committee of the House back in the 1950s, and I used to visit him in his office. He was a great admirer of my book, and I have his letter reproduced in the book. And he said, "You know, Eustace," I'm sitting in his office, and he said, "There are two things I need." He was getting old. He said, "There are two things I want to do before I die. I want to find out who owns the stock of the Federal Reserve banks, and I want to audit them." Well, he died without achieving either objective. And at that time, I myself had not completed my research to find out who the owners were. And I finally found out about 10 years after Wright Patman died, and that information is in there. And of course, no surprise that the owners of the stock since 1914 are the big rich, the elitists, the Rockefellers, the Harrimans, the Warburgs, the Schiffs. And in fact, Governor Clinton, the representative of the little man, is now going to send Pamela Harriman to Europe as an ambassador.
Tell us about, how do the Harrimans, and tell us about Prescott Bush and George Bush. I mean, if this is going to be a conspiracy, it has to kind of go up the ladder, doesn't it? I mean, are these families that kind of work themselves in and then just stay there forever?
Well, that's absolutely true, because in order to have reliable people, you have to have families which continue generation after generation. I call them the dynastic families of the world order, because these are true dynasties. You know, the old monarchical dynasties of Europe are pretty well gone, except for the British royal family. And the reason that they are still in power is they represent the old Canaanites, which go back 5,000 years, the black nobility. And in fact, most of the wealthy families of the world today are, well, I'd say all of them are in the black nobility. They're all interrelated. They have arranged marriages to protect the money, you see. And they have common goals. They have a common program.